Picture your alarm going off tomorrow morning. You silence it, sit up, and immediately start thinking about everything you have to do. Work, errands, emails, a to-do list that never seems to get shorter. You assume that being busy is just part of being human, but it isn't. It's part of being a very specific kind of human, living in a very specific sliver of history. Because for almost all of human existence, your ancestors weren't busy, not even close. And what they were actually doing instead will completely change how you understand yourself. The assumption most people carry is that ancient life was brutal and exhausting. Endless hunting, constant running from predators, back-breaking labor from sunrise to sunset just to survive. It sounds logical. Survival is hard. Primitive tools are inefficient. So ancient humans must have worked constantly. But that assumption is wrong. And the evidence dismantling it has been sitting in plain sight for decades. In 1966, anthropologist Marshall Salins presented a paper that shook the academic world. He called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society, not because they had wealth in the modern sense, but because they had something far more valuable: time. Salins analyzed dozens of studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups whose way of life closely mirrored what your ancestors experienced for hundreds of thousands of years, and what he found was startling. These people worked, on average, between 3 and 5 hours per day to meet all of their survival needs. That was it. The rest of the day was theirs. 3 to 5 hours. Think about that against your own schedule. Studies of the Kungsan people of the Kalahari Desert, one of the most thoroughly documented hunter-gatherer groups in history, showed that adults spent roughly 2 to 3 days per week actually foraging for food. The other days were spent resting, socializing, telling stories, making music, and doing things that had nothing to do with immediate survival. Anthropologist Richard Lee spent years living with the Kung and cataloged their activities in meticulous detail. What he found was a people who were, by nearly every measure, not overworked. They were leisurely, deliberately, structurally leisurely. But how is that possible? How did they eat? The answer is efficiency. Not technological efficiency, ecological efficiency. Your ancestors didn't try to control their food supply. They read it. They knew which plants fruited when. They knew which animals moved where and why. They understood their environment the way you understand your own neighborhood. And because of that knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years and passed down through stories and observation, they could extract exactly what they needed without excess effort. They weren't working harder. They were working smarter, in a way perfectly tuned to the world around them. A typical morning for one of your ancestors, perhaps 70,000 years ago, might have looked something like this. Wake with the sun. Not because of an alarm, but because the body, unfiltered by artificial light, synchronized naturally with the sky. Eat something left from the evening before, or forage briefly near camp. Then, depending on the season and the group's needs, perhaps join a small hunting party or gather plants with a few others from the group. Not alone, never alone, always in the company of people you had known your entire life. And here is something that almost never gets mentioned. The work itself wasn't experienced as work. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying the mental state humans enter when a task perfectly matches their skill level. He called it flow, a state of effortless absorption, where time seems to stop and the self dissolves into the activity. Csikszentmihalyi found this state in artists, athletes, surgeons, and musicians. But it almost certainly describes what your ancestors felt while tracking an animal across familiar terrain, reading broken branches and disturbed earth like a language. They weren't grinding through a task. They were fully alive inside it. By midday, the foraging or hunting was often done. What came next was the part of ancient life that most modern reconstructions completely ignore. Rest. Real, unscheduled, guilt-free rest. Anthropological records across dozens of hunter-gatherer groups describe long afternoon periods of lying in shade, napping, grooming one another, watching children play. Not rest as recovery from exhaustion, rest as a fundamental feature of the day. Not earned, not scheduled, just built in, the way breathing is built in. Then came what many researchers now believe was the most important activity in the ancient human day: sitting around the fire. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years analyzing fireside conversations among the Kungsan, recording and categorizing what people actually talked about during the day versus what they talked about at night. The difference was dramatic. Daytime talk was mostly practical: complaints, economics, criticism. But nighttime talk, the fire talk, was something else entirely. Stories. Long, detailed, emotionally rich narratives about people, spirits, distant places, and events that had happened years or generations before. Wiesner's research, published in 2014, argued that these fireside stories were foundational to human social bonding, moral development, and the transmission of cultural knowledge across generations. The fire wasn't just warmth. It was the internet. It was the library. It was the classroom and the theater all at once. Your ancestors sat around that fire and listened to stories that explained the world. Stories that told them who they were, where they came from, and what their group believed. The children absorbed it without being taught. The elders reinforced it without needing a curriculum. And in the telling and retelling over thousands of years, across thousands of fires, something remarkable happened. A shared identity formed. A culture took shape. A self emerged. This is where things get strange. Because when you watch a compelling video late at night, or get pulled into a long conversation around a dinner table, or lose track of time in a story that feels too real to stop, your brain is doing something ancient. It is sitting around that fire. The content has changed. The technology has changed. But the neural circuits lighting up inside you are identical to the ones that lit up in your ancestors 10,000 years ago in the dark. Now think about what is missing from that ancient daily life. There was no commute, no inbox, no performance review, no mortgage, no traffic, no social media algorithm designed to keep you anxious and scrolling. There was no concept of being behind. There was no future deadline hanging over the present moment. Ancient humans lived in what psychologists call psychological presence, not by discipline or meditation, but simply because the structure of their lives did not demand anything else. That doesn't mean their lives were easy. Disease existed. Violence between groups happened. Childbirth was dangerous. Predators were real. But these were acute threats, not chronic ones. Your nervous system was built for acute stress followed by long recovery. A lion appears. You run or fight. The lion is gone. Your body returns to baseline. Modern life inverts this entirely. The threats are chronic, low-level, and never fully resolved. The deadline doesn't end. The financial pressure doesn't go away. The inbox refills. And your ancient nervous system, unchanged in any meaningful way since the savannah, sits inside that modern environment and quietly burns. Evolutionary biologist Daniel Lieberman at Harvard has written extensively about this mismatch between the bodies and brains we inherited and the environments we now inhabit. His term for it is evolutionary mismatch. Your body is running ancient software on a modern machine, and the bugs show up everywhere. In chronic stress, in sleep disorders, in back pain from sitting in chairs all day, in anxiety that has no identifiable predator to run from. Your ancestors didn't have better lives in every way, but they had something you almost certainly don't have enough of: unstructured time, genuine stillness, the experience of a day that didn't need to be optimized. Here is the uncomfortable mirror that the anthropological record holds up to modern life. The thing you call relaxation, the vacation you save for, the weekend you collapse into, the 15 minutes of quiet you carve out before the day begins, that wasn't a reward your ancestors worked toward. It was the baseline. It was Tuesday. And the restlessness you feel when you aren't doing something productive, that is new. That is cultural, not biological. Your body doesn't know what to do with the guilt of stillness because stillness was never something that needed justification. It was just life. So tomorrow morning, when the alarm goes off and the to-do list starts assembling itself in your mind before your eyes have fully opened, remember something. Somewhere deep inside you, in circuits that haven't changed in 100,000 years, there is still an ancestor sitting in the shade of an acacia tree, watching the afternoon light move across the grass, not thinking about anything in particular, not falling behind, not failing, just existing completely in the only moment that has ever actually been real. That is what ancient humans actually did all day. And part of you has never stopped wanting to do exactly the same thing.